Before we check into today's video, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed. It's totally free and allows you to never miss one of our stories. The dark and angular shape of the Abraxas Authority's greatest warship, the AAN Undeniable Mandate, was the single most recognizable sensor silhouette in the entire Milky Way galaxy. It had shattered empires, turned entire armadas to dust, fought and won battles in every sector of the Milky Way. It was there for the very beginning of the Authority's conquest, when the first warlike Abraxas looked up to the stars just out of their reach and unanimously thought to claim those pinpricks of light for themselves, and it served that despotic regime for 2 long millennia before the primitive apes known as humans broke the Authority's shackles and brought that fabled warship low. For 2,000 years, the Abraxas Authority had conquered system after system, sector after sector, nation after nation, of this once diverse universal body until it had colonized and controlled every star system it could reach. 80 standard years had passed since the last pocket of legitimate resistance was snuffed out near the galactic rim. 80 standard years in which the Abraxas Authority ruled with unquestioned supremacy. Life under the Authority was based on a caste system, with the Abraxas, its founding members, at the top. The species they conquered, though they were all peoples of diverse and rich cultures before their subjugation under the Abraxas heel, were molded by brute force and iron grip into tools meant to serve one single purpose. The Selvor were an amphibious species whose hardy scales and strong bodies made them ideal for labor in harsh conditions. The Kravk were eusocial insectoids that once built nests of incredible complexity on their arid homeworld, now known as Kravk A. Once the Abraxas discovered it early in their conquest, they eradicated any trace of Kravk national identity, and the now enslaved insects quickly became known throughout the Authority as construction and demolition experts. The Vrali, brittle-boned avians with feathers of unparalleled beauty, were selected to fill the unexpected role of the Authority's most ruthless enforcers. Before the arrival of the Abraxas Authority, the Vrali prided themselves on their operas and songs. It was said that hearing a Vrali sing could move even a stone to tears. Their military fought hard against the enslaving Abraxas, harder than any who had resisted before it, until the Authority's war machine crushed their hopes of resistance and molded every remaining Vrali into a hard, fanatical, brainwashed killer. Gone were the days when Vrali singers would mesmerize audiences in their capital's opulent opera houses. Now the only things one heard from their beaks were battle cries and the squawk of orders. The fate of the galaxy's most famous caged birds, though undeniably tragic, was lamented by none. Their masters, who never shied from throwing legions of Vrali into the meat grinder for personal glory or selfish ambition, cared nothing for the beauty and value they destroyed when they shaped their subjects into their desired molds. And the thousands of enslaved species below them, though they knew the Vrali were technically slaves themselves, found it hard to feel sorrow for the burdens the avians bore, while Vrali shock troopers were firing microwave weapons over their heads. Truly, their fate was the loneliest of all the Authority's subject races. And then we have the humans. Nobody in the Abraxas Authority, nobody of any importance at least, really cared about the humans. They were among the last species to be conquered, more because of their very fortunate astrographical position than any real defensive abilities. And by the time their pathetic homeworld was subsumed into the Abraxas Authority and given the moniker Human A, the war against the Srov was reaching its high point, and the local sector authority had bigger problems to deal with than one pathetic early space-age uplift. They sent the standard assimilation package, a squadron of Authority Navy ships along with a contingent of Vrali Marines and a unit of sapientologists to guide the pacification of the human race, and waited patiently for the Human A expedition to report their results. Within 10 years, the human race's spirit was totally and completely crushed. Tiny pockets of resistance yet remained, single-digit groups of insurgents hiding in the wilderness from the Abraxi authorities' watchful eye, but they were insignificant and doomed to die. The Authority expedition, which had a grand total of 12 genuine Abraxi members, reported a resounding success. Another victory for the Abraxi, another defeat for freedom in the galaxy. As humanity was integrated further and further into the fold of the Abraxi Authority, the humans who lived at the time began to believe brighter times were ahead. The Abraxi Authority claimed that it saw the value in every life form, from the very smallest single-celled microbes, all the way to the Vrali and Krav and every other species that formed the very backbone of the Abraxi Authority's hierarchical system. Many humans, fooled by this insidious propaganda, began to believe in the Authority's empty promises of a utopian future. But no utopia ever came. The once green world, called Human A, was grasped and crushed to dust by the ever-turning gears of the Abraxi Authority's megalithic machines. Its forests were stripped bare for their precious wood, its oceans choked of life by the constant toil of the Authority's polluting industry. Its people, the nearly irrelevant humans, were tossed to the side as soon as they were fully indoctrinated. There was no real use to this new race, no real purpose for them that was not already being filled by one or more species in that sector of space alone. The prestige of founding a new world was quickly stripped from Human A's overseers, and then later from their sons and daughters, until all that was left was the sorry state of the human race and the shame and ignominy of governing a desolate world. But all was not lost for the slaves of the galaxy. The Abraxi Authority seemed unstoppable, even its very size nigh incomprehensible, and the resources it could bring to bear were great enough that even the stars themselves could be shackled and redirected as the Abraxi Authority pleased. Many a world in the Authority's developed systems had been shrouded in darkness by the star-shrouding bulk of a Dyson sphere. It was said by the few remaining human physicists, for the study of science was a task the Authority left to other species, that such a feat was impossible. None were considered important enough to be given the news that they were wrong. The Abraxi Authority seemed a permanent fixture on the galaxy, as immovable and indestructible as the very stars themselves. But even the brightest stars were still doomed to die. 80 years was barely even a single click on the galactic clock, but for the sapients who ruled over that galaxy, it was a lifetime. Many Abraxi had already grown complacent with their status and prestige. The core worlds had not seen a significant uprising in the past 1,000 years. Their Abraxi overlords had grown sloppy. Their contingents of Vrali soldiers, the Abraxi Authority's sword and scalpel rolled into one brightly feathered package, had grown dull from lack of use. The Authority's core worlds were seen by most of its population as bastions of prosperity and civilization, and it was said that only the most elite of the elite were even allowed to tread on their hallowed soil. As time went on, and the enemies of the Authority were subsumed into its ever-expanding territory, that assessment became further and further from the truth. Just as the Abraxi Authority's expansion had started at its very core, its decay spread out from there as well. Bit by bit, sector by sector, the vaunted might of the conquering Abraxi began to falter. Fueled by nepotism, corruption, lethargy, and 1,000 other poisons, the mammoth and labyrinthine state of the Abraxi Authority deteriorated exponentially with each passing year. Like a colossal machine that had a vial of acid thrown into its gears, the incomprehensible might of the Authority began to fail from the inside, long before it showed any external symptoms. Then, as always, it had maintained its image of unfathomable vastness and crushing military power, but the real force behind it grew ever weaker. By the time any organized resistance grew brave enough to challenge the Lovecraftian might of the Abraxi Authority, 80 years after it consumed the last free species into its vast empire, the nation-state that fought to quell it had become a shadow of its former self. Now, of course, is when the little-known and unimportant apes known as humanity finally became relevant. Their dead homeworld, long since despoiled by the authorities' constant industry, became the centerpiece of a violent uprising against the despotic rule of their Abraxi overlords. It all started when the Abraxi whose task it was to rule that system was told by his superiors to let it die. The discussion was cold, clinical, reminiscent of that very same evil a general might have when he turns the key to launch an atomic warhead. There was no discussion of the lives that would be lost, no discussion of the Vrali, Kravk, and all the other authority races they were leaving on that world to die. It was simply a matter of pragmatism. The colony of Human A cost more resources to maintain than it brought in through operation. Strip mining crews had stripped the dust-choked world of most of its resources, and what little was left was not easy to get at. Were the authority in its prime, it might have seen fit to relocate the operation or repurpose the world. Even the Human A system's asteroid belt, which had been mostly stripped of its wealth by Abraxi Authority asteroid crackers, might have proved ideal for further exploitation. But the Abraxi Authority was not in its prime. Far from it, in fact. It was cannibalizing itself in much the same manner as a starving man might, gobbling up its reserves of energy and cutting off excess expenditures to make sure the lack of necessary resources did not begin to affect its ruling brain. And, in the inhumane calculus of an empire that ruled over an expanse of 400 billion stars, outer rim worlds like Human A were just dead weight, and dead weight had no place in the authority. A few people cheered when the last of the Abraxi ships left orbit. A few others lamented their overlord's flight. Most, however, simply watched in indifferent silence. Work had to go on as always. Quotas had to be met. Regulations had to be obeyed. Reports had to be submitted. The trillions of cogs in the great Abraxi machine could not afford to think independently, especially not with the authorities' boot pressing constantly down on their necks. For quite some time, in spite of their newfound independence from the rule of the authority, life went on as usual. It took many months for the planetary authorities to realize something was wrong. In the absence of an Abraxi to lead them, the planet's security and logistical units had stepped up to run the colony. The logistical corps did their best to ensure the colony survived, but they were still operating under the rules of the authority. No changes could be made to the doctrine. No action could be taken to stop the depletion of the food stores. Even when the landing pads and cargo stores became filled with crates of processed metals, waiting for authority cargo ships that would likely never come, not one officer ever suggested using some of their vast reserves. When a flea is placed under a glass for many days, and the glass is suddenly removed, it will never jump higher than it could under the glass. On Human A, the glass had been removed. The fleas had yet to jump higher. The first signs that this system was unsustainable came in the form of food riots. For weeks now, miners who had met their quota had received meager or no rations, but the constant threat of Raleigh death squads kept them in line until the pain of hunger grew too great to bear. When the planet's security commander heard of these riots, spreading through her security sectors like wildfire, she panicked and sent riot squads immediately because the Abraxi Authority did not tolerate dissent. When the planet's quota supervisor heard of the drop in productivity, he panicked and increased the next month's quota because the Abraxi Authority did not tolerate laxity. When the planet's processing overseer heard that his source of raw materials had been disrupted, they panicked and sent a request to the logistical corps to produce more mining equipment because the Abraxi Authority did not tolerate failure to meet one's quota. It took many days before the authorities of Human A consciously realized they were not under the power of the Abraxi Authority anymore. Many months before they repaired the damage their stagnation had done. Many years before they built up their planet's industrial, military, and technological base far enough to look to the stars and dare to reach for them. But when the first human Confederacy stellar fleet launched to see what had become of the vaunted authority, systems fell to them in droves. As the Abraxi authority grew, it began to decay. As it decayed, it began to fail. At first, the failure was slow, concealed, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic paperwork and legions of avian jackboots. But then the facade broke, and after that, the decay became collapse. Everywhere the Confederate fleet went, they found the remnants of what had once been an unstoppable empire. Derelict machines whose maintainers had long since abandoned them. Cargo cults worshipping the relics of the authority's oppressive rule. Worlds that had fallen into civil war, anarchy, or even outright extinction in the absence of the Abraxi authority. Each and every one clung to the human confederacy as a drowning man might cling to a lifeline. Designed to be dominated by a higher power, purposefully left incapable of fending for themselves, planet after planet joined the expanding confederacy as it chased after the remnants of the retreating Abraxi authority. It took them merely a decade to finally catch up. By then, the Abraxi had restored some semblance of stability in their decaying husk of an empire. The soldiers of their army were put to work as laborers, the ships of their navy stripped of parts bit by bit, and the strength of the empire frantically readjusted as the dying authority tried to stem its bleeding. It worked for a time, and the ruling Abraxi who commanded what they could salvage held out hope that soon their authority could return in force to the parts of the galaxy they had abandoned and extract every last bit of value from those worlds. Then, of course, the humans came, and they did not meet the Abraxi authority with open arms. The first engagement between Confederate and Abraxi forces happened over a century after the authority's short-lived domination of the Milky Way began. It ended in a crushing defeat for the Abraxi, a sign of their empire's institutional decay, along with the fact that they hadn't had to wage war against a peer military in over a millennium, and a euphoric victory for the human confederacy, as they realized they could fight and even beat an enemy that still ruled over 100 billion worlds. The Abraxi response was crushing. Though they were fighting thousands of fires all across authority space, each one threatening to become a conflagration that would consume everything their race had built, the human confederacy had dealt them a blow like no other before. The 81st Enforcement Squadron was dispatched at once to deliver the upstart humans crushing retribution. Then, when it did not return, the 90th, 205th, and 5,000th were sent out to avenge their fellow soldiers. After 2 hard years of hard campaigns and unsustainable losses, they were forced to withdraw from the worlds of the ever-expanding human confederacy. This was when the Abraxi realized they had to crush this threat there and then. Their own authority had risen to power precisely because of the indifference of powers greater than them. They would not make the same mistake. Authority intelligence reports, growing more reliable by the day as their reforms breathed new life into the creaking gears of their ancient machine, stated that the Confederate fleet had expended most of their modern munitions. It would have been easy for any sizable Abraxi force to invade their space and crush their navy in open combat. But the authority wanted to be sure. There was one war fleet they held in reverence above any other. One hammer they could always depend upon to crack the hardest stone. One shield they could throw before any attack and emerge from behind it unscathed. The 1st Enforcement Squadron, and its legendary flagship, the Abraxi Authority Navy Dreadnought Undeniable Mandate. Its commander, a wise and strategic Abraxi known to the soldiers of the enforcement squadrons as Avrielian the Godsend, was considered by many to be among the greatest Abraxi to ever live. He had already crushed no less than 7 uprisings, and reclaimed thousands of worlds that the authority in its retreat had so hastily abandoned. To fight against Avralian was to fight a force of nature, to draw your sword on a supernova and expect to emerge victorious. There was no greater folly. "I will complete my task," Avralian had sworn to the Supreme Authority when he received the order. "The undeniable mandate will return victorious." The traditional ending to that oath, or not at all, was purposefully left absent. Squadron Authoritarian Avralian had never lost a battle. He had no reason to expect that to change. His squadron pushed further than ever before into the territory of the Human Confederacy. They burned the 5th and 6th Confederate armadas in orbit around a neutron star. The 7th was turned to dust as it met the Abraxi charge 2 star systems over. The pride of the Confederate fleet destroyed in just 2 battles. The Human Confederacy seemed doomed. Squadron Authoritarian Avralian decided on a final killing blow to finish the job. A direct thrust at the Confederate capital of Liberty's home, known to the Abraxi Authority simply as Human A, to subjugate that rebellious world and bring the Human Confederacy under the Abraxi boot once more. He met the 1st Confederate Armada in the star system of Alpha Centauri, not relevant enough to warrant renaming, and it was there that he found the true ferocity with which humans were willing to fight to defend their freedom. "Sensors officer, fleet officer, status reports," Avralian barked as soon as his flagship entered the star system. His crew was elite, hand-picked from the best of the Authority space fleet, but Avralian had a tendency to micromanage. After all, he was an Abraxi, and every Abraxi seemed to be convinced that no one alive could do the job better than them. "I want the fleet placed in a defensive formation and on the move to the next jump point immediately." "As you command, Authoritarian," his navigation officer said. She was a Rexian, a many-limbed creature whose species the Abraxi had modified over generations to be the ideal crewman of an interstellar ship, and she sat in the middle of a spherical chamber, with inputs and controls on all sides. The only way to escape her station, perhaps in the case of an order to abandon ship, was to have its hatch unlocked from the outside by a crew member with the relevant security key. This principle had led to the needless deaths of many an Authority crewman. Still, Avralian saw no reason to let it stop. "Authoritarian, the fleet report is in," his communications officer reported. He too was a Rexian, though he was smaller and his carapace had not yet hardened from its latest molt. Millennia of tampering by Abraxi geneticists had made Rexian exoskeletons into their own biological versions of an airtight spacesuit. Any of their species who was a trained Authority Navy crewman, such as the hundreds of thousands of Rexians aboard the undeniable mandate, could survive up to 3 hours in hard vacuum, with only some adverse side effects. Any who were not worth the cost it took to heal these effects were given a second chance to perform their duties with the impediment. If they failed, they were euthanized and replaced with a fresh Rexian straight from the egg sac. Even the elite officers aboard the undeniable mandate were little more than cogs in a machine that ground worlds to dust in order to benefit only the Abraxi at its controls. None of them complained or felt mistreated. None of them had ever known how. "Well?" Squadron Authoritarian Avralian asked. "What is it, officer?" "The 1st Enforcement Squadron reports all hulls in position and intact, Authoritarian. 109 ships of the fleet in total, sir. All report ready to comply with any directives." "Are they assembled in the formation I ordered?" Avralian snapped. "No, Authoritarian," was the report. "The fleet is maneuvering as per your directives." "As they should be." Avralian waved his communications officer off. "Navigator, do your scans detect any ambushes?" Avralian's navigator felt offended at her superior's constant micromanagement. She was perfectly capable of and willing to alert her superior officer of any enemy movements in the region. Even a hydrogen molecule could not exist inside the undeniable mandate sensor range without its officers having full knowledge of its presence. But she wisely remained compliant. If Avralian the Godsend did not have direct control over every aspect of a battle, he felt constrained. and an Abraxi who felt constrained typically resorted to violence until they gained the power they wanted.
"No, authoritarian," she reported. "If I detect any signs of hostile movement, I will be certain to alert you."
"As you should," Aurelian snapped. He considered himself the perfect leader, though he was very far from the truth, and so he thought it was entirely possible to expect those under his command to serve as the perfect followers. His model of leading, constant and laborious micromanagement of the systems and ships under his command, was a stark contrast from the idle neglect of the Abraxi of generations past. It was precisely this neglect that allowed the authority to collapse in the first place, and thus spawned such nations as the Human Confederacy that the Abraxi authority now sought to suppress. When Aurelian conquered the authority's foes, and the last of the rebellious worlds were finally returned to the fold, he would usher in a new age of Abraxi dominance. And if he had his way, it would last until the stars themselves grew old and died. The Abraxi Authority fleet passed confidently through the Alpha Centauri system. They had nothing to fear from the defeated Human Confederacy. Why would they? The Confederacy's best fleets had already been destroyed, their best commanders atomized, their best crews and warships annihilated in the all-consuming beam of the Abraxi Authority Navy's matter converters, and there was nothing its billions of soldiers and citizens could do now but submit or die. But the human race had not clawed its way off its dying homeworld and breathed new life into thousands of dead worlds, just to fall after they had finally come so far. They were not the same primitive creatures the Abraxi had subjugated when their empire still ruled over 400 billion stars. They were not willing to go quietly into the night a second time.
"Squadron Authoritarian!"
Avralian's navigation officer barked.
"Enemy contacts! 300! Confederate warships closing from directly ahead!"
Human Confederacy ships were smaller, weaker, but usually far more numerous than their Abraxi foes. The Authority Navy's heavy reliance on matter conversion weapons, which converted matter on an enemy ship to energy while balancing the equation by converting the shooter's energy reserves to an equivalent amount of matter, forced the Confederate fleet to rely heavily on shields to avoid being decimated with a few short volleys. The Human Confederacy, on the other hand, bombarded the colossal forms of Abraxi ships of the line with energy lances and long-range antimatter missiles before closing the distance to finish off their foes with powerful volleys from their railgun batteries. Already, the Confederate fleet had launched a volley of warheads to make contact with the 1st Enforcement Squadron's forward element.
"Recall the forward element and recycle all elements according to my directives,"
Avralian ordered, spitting out a series of commands in naval jargon that would have been incomprehensible to any civilian. Even many crewmen aboard the undeniable Mandate, the gargantuan Abraxi dreadnought that seemed more like a city in space than a warship of reasonable size, could not have understood or fulfilled them. Any Abraxi warship, even after their navy was reformed, was fueled and run primarily by the labor of a massive lower class of menials and slaves. The Mandate's marine contingent, 80,000 well-trained Vrali, was armed with stunners and neural agonizers precisely for the purpose of putting down unrest among these slaves.
"I want elements 3 through 7 deployed along the following vectors, arranging their ships in a grid pattern 3 assets deep, and place their capital assets at the direct front of each formation. When I give the word, transition each element into a spearhead formation and engage the enemy in close combat."
"Warhead contact in 30 seconds, an officer barked. 20 seconds.
"Intensify point defense. Fire along the following vectors and slave all PDC batteries directly to my console."
Avralian's manipulator arms played across his command console, directing the undeniable Mandate's batteries of flak cannons with unmatched accuracy and speed. Confederate warheads were rendered inert by the hundreds as Authority Navy warships cut them down with their point defenses.
"Intensify fire," Avralian barked. "Intensify! Focus defensive efforts on warheads inside the following target spheres.
Contact in 10 seconds, the same officer from earlier reported. He tapped frantically on his control console, initiating damage control protocols and diverting power to the mandate's shields. Brace! 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 100 explosions rippled across the undeniable mandate's formidable hull. Not one scratched its surface. Still, the force of 112 atomic bombs was nothing to dismiss idly. Authoritarian! Shields are at 80%! Electrical fires on 17 decks!
Scramble damage control units and recharge the shields, Aurelian commanded. Have the fleet transition into spearheads as I planned. Begin closing the distance with the Confederate Armada.
Fleet report is in, Authoritarian, said an officer. We have sustained negligible damage. Most of the warheads were destroyed by our defensive batteries.
As I expected, Aurelian said, clearly pleased. Proceed as planned.
One of his other officers then spoke up. Authoritarian, we have a new update. Aurelian turned to him. Ships of the fleet that were struck by the attack report higher external radiation than those that were not. The enemy is probably using atomic weapons against us.
Atomics?
Aurelian asked, amused by his enemy's primitive display of firepower. To bring atomic warheads to a naval battle of this day and age was akin to hurling rocks at a regiment of pre-authority United States Army regulars. The power such weapons could bring to bear was by no means insignificant, but it paled in comparison to the deadly force of modern naval weaponry.
Primitive fools!
Aurelian dismissed the Confederate attack.
They're irrelevant. Proceed as planned.
The Authority fleet began to close the distance. Matter converter range in 60 seconds, Authoritarian, an officer called out. What are our targets?
Open a channel to the entire fleet, Aurelian ordered. I will select targets for their guns. Focus on these vessels first, then move on to the rest as per standard targeting doctrine. Clear?
Yes, Authoritarian. Aurelian proceeded to select over 80 ships for annihilation with his Matter's fleet conversion weapons. The human Confederacy did not launch a second wave of warheads, likely because of the first round's ineffective nature, but they began to pelt the Abraxi fleet's powerful shields with barrage after barrage of energy and kinetic weapons.
We've lost the immutable law,
an officer called out.
The mandate's shields are at 60%.
Aurelian barked his orders.
Recycle the elements along these directives and begin a sweeping barrage across the enemy fleet. After that, fire a series of directed lance strikes into the following sections of the Confederate formation, and follow it up with converter fire on any wounded opponents.
Authority ships burned and died, their defenses being overwhelmed by the destructive power of the Confederacy's guns, but the squadron as a whole pressed ever onward. Converter range, now! Instantly, invisible beams of death shot out from the Abraxi Authority's warships. Plumes of hydrogen gas, a side effect of the matter converters being fired, spewed out from vents on their hulls. The matter conversion weapons were ineffective against shields, requiring an incredible expenditure of power to breach even a fragile hard energy barrier. But once they got through, the carnage was immense. Confederate warships were removed from space as if they were never there. The human Confederacy's fleet was not frightened or cowed by their enemy's deployment of such formidable weapons. They were the last hope of their nation, the last chance at freedom for their race. And, if the Abraxi Authority wanted to put humankind in shackles yet again, they were determined to make them work for it.
Another missile barrage,
an officer called out.
Impact in 30 seconds. Intensify point defense fire. Assemble in defensive formation immediately.
Aurelian's ships did as they were ordered. Their flak cannons lit up the darkness, sending energy lancers burning through the hulls of the Confederacy's nuclear missiles.
Cut those primitive weapons down.
Proximity klaxons blared.
Brace! Brace! Brace!
Nuclear explosions began to ripple across the Mandate's hull. Electrical fires started on every deck, the consequences of generations of poor maintenance and damage control teams of slaves scrambled to fight them. In some areas, where the fire had grown too dangerous, the order was given to depressurize the entire compartment with the slaves inside. Unskilled labor was easy to replace. "Shields at 40%, an officer reported. "Authoritarian, a few more barrages like that will ruin us."
"Bring the undeniable mandate back to the center of our formation," Avralian commanded. "I'll send elements forward to fill the gap in our lines."
"Squadron Authoritarian, it's not just the mandate that's damaged," another officer said uneasily. "We've lost 13 ships. 40 more have suffered hull damage. Only 28 ships, including the undeniable mandate, have their shields still raised."
"And the Confederate fleet?"
"Down to roughly 200 ships, sir," was the report. "Judging by scans of the wrecks, their atomic weapons are concentrated on the largest craft. All others appear to be escorts or pickets."
"Then concentrate your fire on the large ones," Avralian snapped. "If they fire another barrage like that, I am a dead man."
Even speaking the words aloud felt like a betrayal of who he was. If Avralian the Godsend could not defeat an enemy, there was no one in the authority who could.
"All ships, concentrate fire!"
The blaring of alarms cut him off.
"Warhead barrage! Contact in 40 seconds!"
Avralian panicked.
"All power to defenses! Energize the shields! I want damage control units on standby immediately!"
He looked frantically about the bridge, barking orders and adjusting ship systems. The Mandate's defensive batteries began to pick off enemy warheads with mechanical precision, cutting down 2/3 of all the munitions aimed at the Abraxi flagship. But they were not enough. The proximity alert sounded again. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Nuclear warheads slammed into the undeniable Mandate's hull. Armor melted away from the heat of the atomic blasts. Electronics were fried by the EMPs and radiation. Even with their inertial dampeners set to the safe limits, the crew of the ship was jolted by the shockwaves of the detonations. "Our shields are down, Authoritarian!" The damage report came trickling in. "Our weapon systems are failing! Our engines are unresponsive! Our active sensors are clouded! What are your orders?" The undeniable mandate was dead in space. "What are your orders, Authoritarian?" Avralian was affixed to his console. Neither in word nor deed did he register any response to his subordinate's frantic queries. One of his officers, entombed in his enclosed station, realized all was lost. He beat frantically against the transparent door to his pod, but it was to no avail. The Abraxi Authority Navy afforded its escape pods only to a select few. Even if he could have got out of his prison, he would have quickly found Marines whose guns would have reminded him that he was not essential enough to be allowed to escape. "Authoritarian," he begged. "Please, we have to abandon ship." Avrali captain, clad in Authority red, stepped to the squadron Authoritarian's side. "Authoritarian," he asked, poking his superior with a claw. "Are you well?" The proximity sirens blared for the final time. Another barrage of nuclear bombs was inbound. Squadron Authoritarian Avralian looked up to meet his captain's eyes.
"But it's so primitive."
The crew of the ship saw a brief flash of light, like the last gasp of a dying sun. After that, there was darkness.